Dr. James Morrison wasn't supposed to be a billionaire. He was supposed to be a doctor. Born in rural Montana in 1975, James grew up in a town so small it didn't even have a hospital. When his younger sister got sick with pneumonia at age 7, his parents had to drive her 3 hours to the nearest emergency room. They almost didn't make it in time. That experience burned itself into James's mind. The feeling of helplessness, of watching someone you love suffer because of something as arbitrary as geography, decided right then that he'd become a doctor. And not just any doctor, he'd figure out how to bring medical care to places that didn't have it. James worked his way through college and medical school, graduating from Johns Hopkins at the top of his class. But instead of taking a lucrative position at a prestigious hospital, he joined Doctors Without Borders. For 5 years, he worked in some of the most dangerous places on earth: war zones in Syria, refugee camps in South Sudan, villages devastated by Ebola in West Africa. And everywhere he went, he saw the same problem. It wasn't that doctors didn't know how to treat diseases. It was that the medicines, the equipment, the infrastructure, it was all too expensive for the people who needed it most. A child would die from a disease that cost 50 cents to cure, simply because that 50 cents wasn't available in a village with no economy. It was insane. It was immoral. And James became obsessed with solving it in 2008. At age 33, James had an idea. What if you could create a medical supply chain that bypassed all the middlemen, all the markup, all the corporate profit-taking? What if you could manufacture generic medications and medical equipment at cost, then distribute them through a non-profit network directly to the places that needed them? It seemed impossible. The pharmaceutical and medical device industries were entrenched, protected by patents, regulations, and lobbying power. But James was a doctor, not a businessman. He didn't know it was impossible, so he tried anyway. He started a company called Lifeline Medical. The concept was simple but revolutionary: manufacture off-patent medications and basic medical equipment at the lowest possible cost, then sell them at cost plus a tiny margin just to sustain operations. No shareholders demanding profits. No executives taking million-dollar bonuses. Just medicine for people who needed it. James invested his savings, about $200,000 from his years working as a doctor. It wasn't enough. So he maxed out credit cards, took out loans, convinced 3 former medical school classmates to join him. They rented a tiny office in Baltimore and got to work. The first year was brutal. They nearly went bankrupt twice. James was working 18-hour days, learning manufacturing, supply chain logistics, international regulations, all while still occasionally flying out to provide medical care in crisis zones. But slowly, Lifeline started to work. They secured their first contracts with aid organizations. Their medications were tested and proven safe. Their costs were dramatically lower than competitors, sometimes 90% cheaper for identical products. And then something unexpected happened. A tech billionaire named Sarah Chun read about Lifeline in an article about innovative approaches to global health. She was so impressed that she flew to Baltimore to meet James. "Dr. Morrison," she told him over coffee in his cramped office, "what you're doing is remarkable. But you're thinking too small. With real funding, real infrastructure, you could scale this globally. You could save millions of lives." Sarah invested $50 million in Lifeline. Then she introduced James to other philanthropic investors. Within 2 years, Lifeline had raised $500 million in funding, all from people who didn't expect profits, only impact. And James delivered. By 2015, Lifeline Medical was operating in 47 countries. They'd provided medications to over 10 million people. They'd built clinics in remote areas. They'd trained local healthcare workers. They'd done exactly what James had dreamed of doing. But here's what made James different from other people who built successful organizations. He didn't care about the credit. Lifeline's board wanted to make him CEO with a substantial salary. James refused. He took a salary of $85,000 a year, enough to live comfortably but nothing extravagant. He still lived in a modest apartment. Still drove a 10-year-old car. Still spent months each year in the field, working directly with patients. "I'm not doing this to get rich," he'd tell people. "I'm doing this because children shouldn't die from preventable diseases." By 2018, something remarkable happened. The philanthropic investors in Lifeline decided to take the company public, not to extract profits, but to raise even more capital for expansion. The IPO was structured unusually. James retained controlling shares, but all profits beyond operational costs would go directly into a foundation for global health. The IPO raised $3.2 billion. And overnight, James Morrison's stake in the company made him a billionaire on paper. Worth approximately $4.70 billion, James didn't change his lifestyle at all. He signed a giving pledge committing to donate 99% of his wealth. He lived in the same apartment, drove the same car, wore the same cheap suits. The only difference was that now he had even more resources to deploy toward his mission. And that mission was about to take a dramatic turn. In early 2019, James was visiting a rural clinic in Uganda when he witnessed something that changed everything. Mother brought in her 9-year-old son. The boy had diabetes, type 1, the kind that requires insulin to survive. In the United States, this would be manageable. Expensive, but manageable. But here, in a village with no electricity and limited refrigeration, insulin was nearly impossible to access. What insulin was available cost more than the family made in months. James watched the boy receive his treatment, knowing that in a few weeks, when the insulin ran out, there would be no more. The boy would die. Not from lack of medical knowledge. Not from lack of treatment options. But from lack of affordable access to a medication that had been discovered a century ago. That night, James couldn't sleep. He'd seen countless preventable deaths, but something about this one stayed with him. Insulin should be cheap. The patent had expired decades ago. The manufacturing process was well understood. So why did it cost so much? The answer, James discovered, was a combination of regulatory capture, manufacturing complexity, and corporate monopolies. 3 major companies controlled most of the world's insulin supply. They'd made incremental changes to insulin formulations, just enough to extend patents and maintain pricing power. A vial of insulin that cost $5 to manufacture was being sold for $300 in some markets. It was, James realized, a perfect example of everything wrong with the pharmaceutical industry. And it was killing people. So James decided to fix it. He assembled a team of biochemists, manufacturing specialists, and regulatory experts. He gave them a seemingly impossible mandate: create a way to manufacture insulin cheaply, safely, and at scale. Make it so affordable that even the poorest communities could access it. It took 2 years of research, development, and testing. Lifeline invested over $400 million into the project. But in March 2021, they succeeded. Lifeline had developed a manufacturing process that could produce insulin at a cost of less than $2 per vial. The insulin was bioidentical to the expensive branded versions. It passed every safety and efficacy test. And because it was based on expired patents, it was completely legal. James's plan was ambitious. Lifeline would build manufacturing facilities in strategic locations around the world. They'd produce insulin at cost and distribute it through their existing network. They'd charge just enough to sustain operations, about $5 per vial, compared to the $150 to $300 charged by major manufacturers. The impact would be staggering. Millions of diabetics in developing countries would suddenly have access to life-saving medication. Even in wealthy countries like the United States, where insulin prices had become scandalous, Lifeline's product would force prices down dramatically. James announced the initiative in May 2021 at a global health conference. The response was overwhelming. Health organizations praised it. Patients' rights groups celebrated. Governments in developing nations immediately reached out about partnerships. But there was one group that wasn't celebrating. the pharmaceutical industry. And specifically one man, Richard Vance. Richard Vance was everything James Morrison wasn't. Where James was humble, Richard was ostentatious. Where James lived modestly despite his billions, Richard owned mansions on 3 continents, a superyacht, and a private jet that had once belonged to a Saudi prince. Where James gave away his wealth, Richard accumulated more. Richard had built his fortune in pharmaceuticals. His company, Vance Pharmaceutical Industries, was one of the 3 major insulin manufacturers. VPI's insulin products generated $8.7 billion in revenue annually, with profit margins exceeding 60%. It was a cash cow that had made Richard one of the 50 wealthiest people in the world. Worth approximately $47 billion, and James Morrison's insulin project threatened all of it. If Lifeline's insulin succeeded, the entire insulin market would collapse. Vance Pharmaceutical wouldn't be able to compete with $5 insulin when they were charging $200. They'd lose billions in revenue. Richard's net worth would crater. But it wasn't just about money for Richard. It was about power. About winning. Richard Vance hadn't become a billionaire by accepting defeat gracefully. He built his empire by crushing competitors, by outmaneuvering rivals, by being more ruthless than anyone else in the room. And he wasn't about to let some do-gooder doctor destroy what he built. Richard's first move was predictable. He tried to buy James out. He had VPI make a $12 billion offer to acquire Lifeline Medical. It was a massive premium over the company's valuation, and it came with assurances that Lifeline's charitable work would continue. James refused without even considering it. "Lifeline isn't for sale," he told Richard's representatives. "Our mission is to provide affordable health care, not to enrich shareholders." Richard tried again, this time going directly to Lifeline's board with a $20 billion offer. Several board members actually wanted James to consider it. That kind of money could fund decades of charitable work. But James saw through it immediately. The day VPI takes over, the insulin project dies. "They're not buying our company, they're buying our silence." The answer is no. When the buyout attempts failed, Richard Vance shifted strategies. And this is where things got dark. Richard had spent decades building relationships with politicians, regulators, and industry groups. He'd donated millions to campaigns. He'd funded think tanks and research institutes. He'd cultivated an entire ecosystem of people who owed him favors. And now he called in. Every single one. The attacks started subtly. Articles appeared in medical journals questioning Lifeline's insulin safety. Articles funded by foundations that Richard controlled, though his involvement wasn't disclosed. Industry trade groups raised concerns about rushed development processes and inadequate testing, despite Lifeline having passed every required safety protocol. Then the regulatory challenges began. The FDA suddenly announced additional review requirements for Lifeline's insulin, requirements that didn't apply to existing insulin products but would delay Lifeline's launch by at least 18 months. In Europe, similar regulatory hurdles mysteriously appeared. James fought back through proper channels, providing additional data, answering every question, but it was like fighting shadows. Every time they cleared one hurdle, another appeared. Then Richard escalated further. Anonymous complaints were filed claiming that Lifeline was violating obscure patents held by VPI. The patents were questionable at best. Courts would likely invalidate them, but the lawsuits would take years to resolve and would tie up Lifeline's resources. Whistleblower allegations surfaced, claiming that Lifeline's manufacturing facilities didn't meet safety standards. Inspections found minor violations that other facilities routinely had but were usually resolved with warnings. In Lifeline's case, they triggered threats of facility closures. James began to realize what was happening. This wasn't normal business competition. This was a coordinated campaign to destroy Lifeline. And all of it traced back, directly or indirectly, to Richard Vance. The two men finally met face-to-face at a pharmaceutical industry conference in Geneva. Richard approached James at a reception. Champagne in hand, a cold smile on his face. "Dr. Morrison," Richard said, "I've been hoping to speak with you." "Mr. Vance." James's voice was controlled, but his eyes were hard. "You know, I actually admire what you're trying to do," Richard said smoothly. "Truly. But you're being naive. The pharmaceutical industry exists for a reason. We invest billions in research. We take enormous risks. We deserve to profit from our innovations." "Insulin was discovered 100 years ago," James replied. "You didn't invent it. You're just exploiting people who have no choice but to pay whatever you charge." Richard's smile didn't waver. "That's one perspective. Here's another. I employ 47,000 people. VPI's investments fund cutting-edge research that saves lives. Our profits enable innovation. If you destroy the insulin market, you're not just hurting me, you're hurting the entire industry's ability to develop new treatments." "That's not true, and you know it," James said. "Your insulin revenue doesn't fund research. It funds your yacht and your political contributions." Now Richard's smile faded. His eyes went cold. "Dr. Morrison, I've tried to be reasonable. I've made generous offers. I've extended every courtesy. But if you insist on continuing down this path, I want you to understand something very clearly." Richard leaned closer, his voice dropping. "I have more resources than you. I have more connections than you. I have politicians, regulators, and judges who owe me favors. I can make your life very, very difficult." James held his ground. "Is that a threat?" "It's a reality check. You're a doctor playing in a world you don't understand. I've been fighting in this arena for 30 years. I will protect my company, my shareholders, and my interests. And if that means destroying Lifeline Medical, then that's exactly what I'll do." "Then I guess we're at war," James said quietly. Richard's cold smile returned. "Yes, Dr. Morrison. I suppose we are. And I've never lost a war." He walked away, leaving James standing there, champagne glass untouched, realizing that everything was about to get much worse. And Richard Vance kept his promise. What happened over the next 6 months was a masterclass in corporate warfare. And Richard Vance was a master. The regulatory attacks intensified. Suddenly, Lifeline's other products, medications they'd been selling safely for years, were being flagged for additional reviews. Shipments were held up at borders. Licenses were questioned. Every aspect of Lifeline's operations was being scrutinized with an intensity that seemed designed to overwhelm them. James had to hire dozens of additional regulatory specialists just to handle the paperwork. Each delay cost money. Each challenge required legal resources. It was death by 1,000 cuts. But Richard wasn't just attacking Lifeline's operations. He was attacking James personally, private. Investigators started digging into James's past. They found nothing scandalous. James had lived a remarkably clean life, but they found things that could be twisted. A patient who died under James's care during his Doctors Without Borders days became a story about medical malpractice. Never mind that James had been working in a war zone with limited supplies and had tried desperately to save the patient. The story made it sound like negligence. Articles appeared questioning whether James's medical license should be reviewed, given his focus on business rather than practicing medicine. Never mind that James still spent months in the field providing care. The implication was clear: he was a businessman pretending to be a doctor. Financial reporters, fed information by sources who stayed anonymous, started questioning Lifeline's finances. Stories suggested the company was financially unstable, that the insulin project had drained resources, that bankruptcy might be imminent. None of it was true. Lifeline was actually in strong financial position, but the stories spooked donors and partners. Then Richard played his darkest card. One of James's key scientists, Dr. Robert Chun, had been leading the insulin development project. Robert was brilliant, dedicated, and completely aligned with Lifeline's mission. He was also drowning in student debt for medical school and supporting elderly parents whose medical bills were crushing them financially. Richard's people approached Robert quietly. They offered him $5 million, a job at VPI with triple his current salary, and a payment of all his debts. All he had to do was resign from Lifeline, take his knowledge to VPI, and testify that Lifeline's insulin development had been reckless and dangerous. Robert refused initially. But Richard's people were persistent. They started pointing out that his parents' medical bills would bankrupt them, that his children's college funds were non-existent, that loyalty was noble but didn't pay for health care or education. They also made it clear, if Robert didn't cooperate, VPI would make things difficult for him. His research credentials would be questioned. His future employment prospects would dim. It wasn't quite a threat, but the message was clear. Robert struggled with the decision for weeks. James noticed he seemed distracted, worried. But when James asked if something was wrong, Robert just said he was tired. Then one Friday afternoon, Robert resigned. He submitted a letter claiming he had ethical concerns about the accelerated development timeline for Lifeline's insulin. He didn't mention VPI or the financial offer, but the damage was done. Within days, VPI held a press conference. They announced they'd hired Dr. Robert Chun as a senior researcher, and they revealed that Dr. Chun had expressed concerns about Lifeline's insulin safety testing. VPI's legal team immediately filed new challenges with the FDA, citing Dr. Chen's concerns as evidence that Lifeline's insulin should undergo additional review. It was devastating. Having a key researcher defect and question the project's safety created exactly the kind of doubt that regulators had to take seriously. The FDA announced another 6-month delay for additional testing. James felt something break inside him. Not his determination, that remained iron strong, but his faith in the system. He'd thought that doing the right thing, following the rules, and having sound science would be enough. He was learning that when you're fighting someone with unlimited resources and no ethics, righteousness isn't enough. Lifeline's board called an emergency meeting. Several members were terrified. The regulatory challenges, the defection, the financial pressure, it was overwhelming. James, one board member said gently, maybe we should consider VPI's offer again. Or at least compromise. We could license the insulin technology to them with guarantees about pricing. No, James said firmly. That's exactly what Richard wants. He wants us to surrender. To give him control. The moment we do that, affordable insulin dies. People die. That's what's at stake here. But James, we might lose everything. The company might not survive this. James was quiet for a long moment. Then he said something that surprised everyone. You're right. We might lose. Richard has more money, more connections, more weapons than we do. If we keep fighting the way we have been, defensively, reactively, we'll probably lose. So we need to change strategies. What do you mean? I mean, James said slowly, that Richard Vance has spent 6 months teaching me how to fight dirty. Maybe it's time I became a better student. James, what are you talking about? James looked around the table at his board. Everything Richard has done to us is technically legal. Barely. He's used the system against us. But here's the thing, if we dig into how he's built that system, how he's maintained his monopoly, how VPI actually operates, I'm willing to bet we find things that aren't legal at all. Things that regulators would care about. Things that the public would care about. You want to investigate VPI. I want to fight back, James said. I've spent my career saving lives. Apparently, to keep saving lives, I need to learn how to destroy my enemies. So that's what I'm going to do. For the first time in months, James smiled. It wasn't a warm smile. Richard Vance declared war on Lifeline because we threatened his profits. Fine. But what he doesn't understand is that I'm not fighting for money. I'm fighting for millions of people who die from treatable diseases because of greed. That's not a business interest. That's a calling. And someone fighting for a calling is a lot more dangerous than someone fighting for a yacht. The board members looked at each other uncertainly. They were used to James the humble doctor, the selfless philanthropist. This version of James, calculating, angry, dangerous, was new. "What do you need?" "From us?" one finally asked. "Approval to spend whatever it takes," James said. "And the understanding that what we're about to do might not be pretty, but it will be necessary." The board approved his plan unanimously. James Morrison was done playing defense. It was time to attack. James's first move was to hire people who knew how to fight the kind of war Richard was waging. He brought in corporate investigators who'd worked for the FBI and SEC. He hired lawyers who specialized in antitrust and fraud cases, the kind of lawyers who took down Enron and exposed the tobacco industry's lies. He retained crisis communications experts who knew how to shape narratives. And he gave them all one directive: find out everything about Richard Vance and Vance Pharmaceutical Industries. Every questionable practice. Every ethical violation. Every skeleton in every closet. What they found was damning. The VPI's pricing practices, it turned out, weren't just aggressive, they were potentially criminal. The investigators discovered internal documents showing that VPI had coordinated with other insulin manufacturers to keep prices artificially high. They divided markets, agreed not to compete in certain regions, and maintained pricing structures that maximized all their profits. Was textbook antitrust violation. The kind that leads to massive fines and potential prison time for executives. But that was just the beginning. James's team also discovered that VPI had been running a secret program paying doctors to prescribe VPI insulin over competitors, payments that were never disclosed to patients or insurers. This violated kickback laws and medical ethics rules. They found evidence that VPI had deliberately delayed generic competition by filing frivolous patents and paying potential competitors to stay out of the market, a practice called pay for delay that the FTC had been cracking down on. They discovered that VPI had been manipulating clinical trial data to make their insulin appear more effective than it actually was. Not enough to be dangerously fraudulent, but enough to justify premium pricing. And perhaps most damning, they found proof that Richard himself had been using VPI resources to fund political campaigns in ways that violated campaign finance laws. He'd been routing money through shell companies and non-profits to hide his involvement. It was a treasure trove of corruption. Years of illegal and unethical practices, all carefully documented in internal emails and financial records. James now had a choice. He could turn all of this over to regulators and law enforcement, which would certainly hurt VPI but might take years to result in actual consequences. Or he could do something riskier but more immediate, could go public. James chose the latter, reached out to investigative journalist of the New York Times, someone known for exposing corporate corruption. He gave her everything his team had found, with all the documentation needed to verify it. The story ran on a Sunday morning in October 2021. The headline: How a Pharmaceutical Giant Built a billion-dollar empire on illegal practices and exploitation. It was devastating, detailed, meticulously sourced, and absolutely damning. The article laid out every illegal practice VPI had engaged in. It included quotes from internal emails where Richard and other executives joked about keeping insulin prices high and called patients captive consumers who'll pay whatever we charge. The public reaction was immediate and explosive. Diabetes patients and their families flooded social media with outrage. Congressional representatives demanded investigations. The SEC and FTC announced they were reviewing VPI's practices. Patient advocacy groups filed class action lawsuits. VPI's stock dropped 34% in 2 days. Richard Vance went into crisis mode. He held a press conference denying everything, claiming the documents were taken out of context, insisting that VPI had always operated ethically and legally. Nobody believed him. But James wasn't done. He'd learned from Richard that you don't just wound your enemy, You finish them. James's communications team had prepared a comprehensive campaign. They'd created a website documenting every instance of VPI's price gouging. Every patient who died because they couldn't afford insulin, every family bankrupted by medical bills. They'd collected video testimonials from diabetes patients who'd had to ration insulin, sometimes with fatal consequences. And they ran targeted ads on every platform, in every market where VPI operated. The message was simple but powerful. While Richard Vance bought yachts, people died. While VPI executives earned bonuses, families went bankrupt. Affordable insulin exists. They just don't want you to have it. The campaign went viral. Within days, it had been viewed over 50 million times. The hashtag affordable insulin now was trending globally. Politicians who'd received donations from Richard started returning the money and calling for investigations. Doctors began publicly questioning why they'd prescribed VPI products. Hospitals and insurance companies started looking for alternatives. But Richard Vance wasn't done fighting either. And his next move proved just how far he was willing to go. Richard's counterattack was vicious and personal. James wanted to make this about ethics and morality. Fine. Richard would destroy James's reputation so completely that nothing he said would matter anymore. Richard's team dug deeper into James's past. They found patients who died while under James's care during his humanitarian work. Never mind that he'd been working in impossible conditions, that he'd saved hundreds of others. They contacted these patients' families and fed them narratives about negligence and malpractice. They created a website called Lifeline Truth that compiled every negative story, every complaint, every questionable decision James had ever made. They hired social media firms to amplify criticisms of James, to create a narrative that he was a fraud, a businessman masquerading as a humanitarian, someone who'd gotten rich off of charity. They even attempted to hack Lifeline systems, looking for embarrassing internal communications. The attempt failed, but it showed how desperate Richard had become. But the most devastating attack came from an unexpected direction. Sarah Chun, the tech billionaire who'd been Lifeline's first major investor and still sat on the board, received a visit from Richard's lawyers. They presented her with evidence, mostly fabricated or exaggerated, suggesting that Lifeline's finances were shakier than disclosed, that James had misled investors about the company's prospects, that the insulin project was a disaster waiting to happen. More importantly, they made Sarah an offer. If she withdrew her support from Lifeline publicly, citing concerns about the company's direction, VPI would pay her $500 million for consulting services and guaranteed returns on future investments. Sarah was offended but also shaken. The evidence they'd presented looked credible, even though it wasn't. She called James and confronted him. "James, is any of this true? Are we in financial trouble?" James was stunned. He'd trusted Sarah completely. "Sarah, none of that is accurate. Richard is feeding you lies. You've seen our financials, you know. We're solid. But these documents are fabrications. Sarah, Richard is trying to turn you against me. Against Lifeline. Against everything we've built together." There was a long pause. "James, I want to believe you. But I have a responsibility to my foundation, to the other investors. I need you to prove these claims are false." "I will. I'll have our CFO send you everything. But Sarah, I need you to trust me. Please." Another long pause. "I'll wait to see the documentation. But James? Be very, very careful. Richard Vance plays a different game than we do. And I'm not sure you're ready for how ugly this could get." Sarah ultimately sided with James after reviewing the real financial data, but the fact that she'd wavered shook him. Richard had shown that he could reach anyone, could plant seeds of doubt even in James's closest allies. James realized that this war couldn't continue indefinitely. Lifeline was bleeding resources. The insulin project, while still moving forward, was months behind schedule. Morale was suffering. And every day they fought Richard was another day that people died from lack of affordable insulin. It was time to end this. James called a meeting with his core team, his CFO, his legal advisors, his investigators, and his communications director. "We've hurt Richard," James said. "VPI's reputation is damaged. They're facing investigations. Their stock is down. But Richard is still fighting, and he'll keep fighting until he destroys us or we destroy him. We need a knockout blow. Something that ends this completely." "What did you have in mind?" his lead investigator asked. "Everything we've exposed about VPI is bad, but it's not fatal. Companies survive scandals. Richard might pay some fines, restructure some practices, and move on. What we need is something that makes it impossible for VPI to continue operating as it has been. Something that forces real change." His general counsel spoke up. "James, we've already given everything we found to regulators and prosecutors. What else is there?" James was quiet for a moment. Then he said something that surprised everyone. "We stop attacking Richard. We make him irrelevant." "What do you mean?" "Richard's power comes from VPI's monopoly. He can fight us because he has massive resources from insulin profits. So we don't just expose his illegal practices, we destroy his business model entirely. We launch our insulin regardless of the regulatory delays. We give it away if we have to. We make VPI's insulin obsolete." "James, we can't launch without FDA approval. We can in other countries," James interrupted. "The FDA has jurisdiction over the U.S. market. But we've been so focused on the U.S. that we haven't fully leveraged our international approval. We have regulatory clearance in 17 countries already. We launch there immediately. Aggressively. We price it so low that VPI can't compete. We take their international markets completely. That won't hurt Richard in the U.S. It will cripple VPI's profits, which means Richard has less money to fight us with. And once we prove that our insulin works safely in international markets, the FDA will face massive pressure to approve it in the U.S. We shift the battlefield to one where Richard's regulatory advantages don't matter." His team looked at each other. It was bold. Risky. But it might actually work. "There's one more thing," James said. "We need to give patients in the U.S. access now, even without FDA approval. Not selling to them, we can't do that legally. But we can run a clinical trial. A massive open enrollment trial where any diabetic patient who wants to participate can get our insulin for free while we collect safety and efficacy data." "That's actually brilliant," his legal counsel said slowly. "It's completely legal. Clinical trial participants aren't consumers, they're research subjects. We'd be following all the protocols. And it would give thousands of people immediate access while also generating the additional data the FDA wants." "Exactly," James said. "We turn Richard's regulatory delays into our advantage. We show that our insulin is safe, effective, and desperately needed. And we make it impossible for the FDA to keep blocking us without looking like they're prioritizing corporate profits over patient lives." The plan came together quickly. Lifeline launched their insulin in all 17 approved international markets simultaneously. They priced it at $6 per vial, barely above manufacturing cost. The response was overwhelming. Within weeks, they'd captured significant market share. VPI's international insulin revenue began to collapse. Simultaneously, Lifeline announced a clinical trial in the U.S. for their insulin product. Enrollment was open to any diabetic patient. The insulin would be provided free to all participants. 50,000 people signed up in the first week. The FDA tried to slow down the trial approval, but the political pressure was too intense. How could they justify blocking a clinical trial that would give desperate patients access to affordable insulin? The trial launched. And almost immediately, Patient testimonials began flooding in. People who'd been rationing insulin, who'd been going into debt, suddenly had access to affordable medication. Their blood sugar stabilized. Their lives improved dramatically. Local news ran story after story about patients who'd been saved by Lifeline's insulin trial.